buried alive at 7,000 meters, frozen, injured, and surrounded by death. They thought surviving the avalanche was their miracle, but the storm wasn't done with them yet, and what came next was colder, crueler, and far more terrifying. Barely breathing under tons of roaring ice and snow on one of the deadliest peaks in the Himalayas. In an instant, tents vanished, climbers disappeared, and silence followed the chaos. You would think for the few who clawed their way out of the White Tomb, the nightmare would be over. You would be wrong. It was just the beginning. Injured, exposed, and stranded above 7,000 meters, they would face something even worse than the avalanche itself. A race against time, cold, and confusion. Because on these mountains, survival isn't a finish line. It's only a temporary pause before the next strike. But what triggered the nightmare on Manaslu's slopes? In September 2012, disaster struck high on Manaslu, Nepal's 8th highest mountain, rising to a brutal 8,163 meters. At Camp 3, under the cover of night, a massive avalanche tore through the mountainside, obliterating over a dozen tents in seconds. Climbers from around the world, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and Nepal were violently swept away or buried alive as thousands of tons of snow thundered down.
He was reading in his Bible, reading his daily devotional, and they heard a sound, and Greg turned to him and said, "Did you hear that wind?" And a second later, he said, "No, that's an avalanche." And he said, then immediately the avalanche hit him. There was about 25 tents at Camp 3. It took them all out.
It was one of the deadliest Himalayan incidents in recent memory. But for the survivors, the true terror wasn't the avalanche itself. It was what came next. In seconds, calm turned to chaos and screams. The avalanche hit like a bomb in the middle of the night. One moment, silence. The next, roaring destruction. Entire tents were ripped from their platforms, hurled into the darkness as climbers were tossed down icy slopes like rag dolls. Some vanished instantly, buried without a sound. Others woke mid-fall, tumbling in total darkness. Visibility dropped to nothing. Disoriented, half frozen and gasping for air, survivors clawed blindly through the snow, driven only by instinct. There was no time to think, no time to plan, only panic, primal fear, and a desperate need to survive kept them going. It was near impossible, but some were still clinging to life. Amid the wreckage, tiny signs of life began to stir. A twitching glove, a muffled scream. Some climbers, under meters of snow, managed to dig themselves out using nothing but their fingertips. Others were spotted by partners scanning the destruction with headlamps, shouting names into the void. Rescue became a race against suffocation and frostbite. There was no gear, no plan, just desperation. In the chaos, survival came down to instinct, luck, and sheer willpower. Inches of snow made the difference between being rescued or never being found at all. Relief came fast, but dread came even faster. At first, survival felt like a miracle. Adrenaline masked the pain. But as dawn approached and the storm settled, the true horror emerged. Camp 3 was gone, flattened. Tents, food, oxygen, even boots and gloves, all buried or blown off the mountain. Survivors stood in the freezing dark, bleeding, half-dressed, and miles above safety. Bones were broken. Skin was already showing signs of frostbite. The brutal cold crept in fast, and with it, the crushing realization. Surviving the avalanche wasn't the end of the danger. It was only the start of a much crueler ordeal. It was now that the mountain began its slow torture. The avalanche was sudden, but the climbers now lay scattered across the debris field with shattered ribs, broken legs, and mangled hands. Frostbite crept in with every breath of thin, freezing air. Some couldn't speak, lips too swollen, minds clouded by shock. Others just stared blankly, unable to process the scale of devastation. Here's the thing. At over 7,000 meters, there was no shelter, no heat, no escape. The wind howled mercilessly. The cold bit through layers of soaked clothing. And the survivors started realizing they weren't just injured, they were exposed and completely alone. And then came the cruelest blow of them all. The avalanche hadn't just buried Camp 3, it obliterated the descent route. What was once a marked path back to safety was now a maze of crevasses, unstable snow bridges, and broken ice. Survivors were trapped on an alien landscape, forced to crawl and stumble across terrain that could collapse beneath them at any moment. Every step was a gamble. One wrong move meant vanishing into a crevasse or triggering another slide. With no ropes, no map, and no clear direction, the mountain had become a deadly labyrinth with literally no way out. They waited for a rescue that wasn't coming. Help was supposed to come from the skies, but the skies had other plans. Helicopters struggled to reach Camp 3, battling brutal winds, thinning air, and blinding clouds. Ground teams were no better off, risking their own lives navigating unstable slopes with almost no information on who was still alive. Radios crackled with confusion. Hours passed, then a full day. Survivors stared into the distance, hoping to hear rotor blades, but only silence came. Some began to realize they might die waiting. With frostbite worsening and hope fading, the unthinkable became the only option: descend, alone and broken. In the void, humanity became their only weapon. In the deadliest silence, something powerful emerged: human willpower. Survivors shared everything from half-frozen gloves, scraps of food, to the last bits of oxygen. One climber dragged a teammate down the slope despite a fractured arm. Another stayed behind, refusing to abandon an injured friend. These weren't just survival tactics, they were acts of defiance against death. In a place where every instinct screamed to save yourself, they chose each other. Amid shattered bodies and broken hope, raw human connection became the lifeline. And on top of that icy cliff, it was the only thing stronger than fear. But fate had one final strike left in store. By now, they had escaped the avalanche, but they hadn't escaped death. As climbers began the torturous descent, new threats emerged. A second avalanche struck part of the slope, burying two more without warning. Others collapsed mid-step, hypothermia triggering cardiac arrest before help could ever reach them. Some slipped, vanishing into bottomless crevasses after a single misplaced boot. Survivors watched helplessly, knowing there was nothing they could do. The cruel irony was impossible to ignore. They had cheated death once, only to lose the battle and its aftermath. They survived the fall, but not the fallout. On Manaslu, survival wasn't a moment, it was a marathon. Climbers who had already clawed their way out of the avalanche faced an even harsher second battle. Frostbite, injury, starvation, and time, all circling the water like hungry sharks. One survivor later said, "I thought I was safe. I was wrong." In the death zone, safety is an illusion. Every breath costs energy. Every hour lost brings the body closer to collapse. The avalanche was only the opening act. The true fight, the one no one trains for, survival. And up here, it's never guaranteed. It's constantly slipping away. Situations like these lead to the hardest question of all. Wait in freezing silence for help that may never come, or descend into a death zone where one wrong step means oblivion. These climbers faced that choice with broken bodies and no guarantees. Some made it, others vanished without a trace, their last footprints now erased by fresh snow. As we reflect on Manaslu's haunting silence, remember, surviving the avalanche was just the beginning. Up next, we expose the dark truth behind the guided expeditions on Everest.